We had a board presentation yesterday about the pandemic and where we are as a county. And frankly, it was, it's a tough thing to be going through, but how we're handling it here in Santa Clara County compared to other counties in California or other states in the nation, we clearly, in my humble opinion, are leading the way in a variety of areas. And a big part of that is, the communication efforts that we are engaging in that are going to involve so many of you, our CBO partners. So I think we are leading the way, and that's largely due to the partnership we have with you on the safety net that we've developed over time. Given the importance of the budget issue, I wanted to take a step back and provide some historical context for how we got here, with an emphasis on ERAF, because ERAF is really one of the big drivers. So first, I'm going to go over a few dates from the long ago past. It'll be brief, but I think these are important dates. So we go back to 1945, and that date is significant because that's when the legislature here in the state of California first allowed redevelopment to exist. And as I'll explain in a little bit, redevelopment has a lot to do, or explains an awful lot of what's going on with ERAF, and I'll explain ERAF as well. Then, as I said, it was brief, so we're going to jump all the way up to 1976. And in 1976, the California Supreme Court decided a case called Serrano versus Priest. That case was about school funding, and you're going to learn that schools are a big part of this mix as well, about how dollars flow for the county. But what Serrano versus Priest said is that school funding had to be equal among public school districts. So, it never happened. But that was the idea in 1976. So in other words, Palo Alto Unified should get, I'm gonna make up a number, $10,000 per student. And the idea was, well, East Palo Alto, or the school district called Ravenswood in East Palo Alto, should also get $10,000 per kid, per student. So that was the idea. As I said, it never happened. Palo Alto and East Palo Alto are good examples. Let me see, you can see Palo Alto is up here. Let's just say they were making, $12,000 a kid, or being funded at that level, whereas Ravenswood, East Palo Alto was at $8,000. People right away said, oh, well, 8 and 12, the midpoint is 10,000. Let's put everyone at 10,000. But back then, what they decided to do is they said, well, that's not good. Why are you going to take a good funding base like 12,000 and bring it down to 10? Instead, let's equalize up. And the idea was, over time, get both up to 12,000. So that was the idea. Then we fast forward 2 years, and what happened is Proposition 13 passed in 1978. What happened is there was a lot of complaining that property taxes were too high and they were uncertain. The reason they were uncertain is because, believe it or not, I was too little as a kid, but I'm told that what they used to do is people would just make budgets, make requests for budgets, and then you do the math, and then you sort of calculate what the percentage tax would be. And that percentage could sometimes be very high and was uncertain and volatile. And so people kept saying, hey, this property taxes, get it under control. And that was not done. And so the voters went out in 1978, put a ballot measure on Prop 13, and that capped it at 1%. If you think about what that also does, remember we were going to try to equalize up for school funding. Well, as we started that process 2 years later, it sort of put a stop to that. So panic ensued. To his credit, back then, Governor Brown, Jerry Brown was governor, and he stepped in and the state helped out local entities. Those sure were the good old days, because things have changed now. And what they ended up doing, because it was a crude measure, they said, well, how do we divide up this 1% of property tax? And they ended up creating these allocation formulas. And in my judgment, I wish they would have done something differently, but what they did is they just created allocation formulas. They said, let's look at what the status quo is today, and let's just freeze that and say everybody gets their current proportion of what they were getting before. So as I'm trying to paint the picture of that there was, rich areas always had more resources to put into government, to put into schools, to put into their operations and into their cities. and poor areas just don't, because the people don't make enough money and they're not going to, authorize and vote for taxes that they can't pay. And so when this whole system was put into place all of a sudden by initiative, and then you just froze in those allocations, you froze in inequity in how California's public finance works. So that had a big impact on two entity types, well, actually three: schools, cities, and then of course the county, because it's so dependent. All those three are interdependent. On schools, let me just briefly say, each school district now has a revenue limit. That's the amount they get per student. This is supposed to come from first from each school district's share of the property tax, that allocation formula that was frozen in time. They get their first chunk of money from there. And then it's the state's responsibility. Let's just say if you're now Ravenswood and you get, or Palo Alto Unified and you're supposed to get $10,000 and your property tax gets you to $8,000, then what's supposed to happen is the state backfills and gives you the extra $2,000, so you get $10,000 per student. That's how the system is set up. Sometimes, where like Palo Alto, another good example, the property values are so high that, let's just say their revenue limit is $10,000, again, just to make the simple number. If you take their share of property taxes and it gets you to $12,500, then what happens is they say, oh, well, you're already past your revenue limit, and so you're not going to get state backfill. And instead they say, well, we will forego any state backfill because we don't need it. We're above our revenue limit. And there used to be a provision in the Constitution, I think it's been amended, but it's not that important, but it used to say that every school district gets $150 per student in basic aid. And so you used to just get that basic aid. And that's why they're called, now you might hear the term, a basic aid school district. It basically means they only are taking their property tax allocation and that exceeds their revenue limit. Then there's cities. Cities, many of them turn to redevelopment because the 1% cap just didn't give them enough money to operate. So you see a lot of cities created huge redevelopment agencies. San Jose did that for a variety of reasons. It's complicated, but San Jose ended up having the single biggest redevelopment agency in California. At the time, they were at a $7.6 billion tax increment cap, which is how much money they were capturing for their redevelopment agency. And they even had a proposal to double that cap to $15.2 billion. And that's had a big, big impact. But San Jose and other cities did it as a revenue source. Let's see, so now so that's sort of the history of it. That's why you had big redevelopment agencies. That's how school districts got to where they are. So now let me jump ahead to 1992, 1993. The state was in a recession. Governor Pete Wilson was in office. And that's when the legislature said, gosh, we don't have enough state general fund to backfill the schools. We're hurting here. And so what they did to solve that problem is they said, we're gonna have each county create an ERAF, or an Educational Revenue Augmentation Fund. And all the taxing entities in the county have to contribute to that ERAF. And now when you have a school district with a revenue limit, they first get their property taxes, then they get money from ERAF, and then if they're still short, then they get the state backfill. And you can see how that benefits the state. The state kept doing things like that, where they kept shifting local dollars to the state to solve their budget problems. Of course, that's just created local problems. They did a lot of what are called realignments, where they realign services and give responsibility down to the, I see the chat, are we supposed to have a slide deck? Sorry, I don't have a slide deck, but I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards to clarify. They realign services down, but they don't give enough money. That's a form of, shifting the burden onto locals. In 2004, and the next important date, I only have 2 important dates left. 2004, local entities said, come on, we can't operate if you keep balancing the state budget on our back. And so local government entities sponsored a Proposition 1A, which now prohibits the state from balancing its budget by reaching in and taking local entities' monies. The last very important date is 2011. Around January 2011, Governor Brown proposed the elimination of redevelopment agencies. A very complicated fight ensued, a legal fight, but eventually it went all the way to the California Supreme Court on an original mandate petition. and redevelopment agencies in California all of a sudden were dissolved and eliminated as of February 1st of 2012. And then what happened is all of the many assets that redevelopment agencies had accumulated over the decades had to be liquidated, and the value of those assets came back to the taxing entities that contributed. You know, one of the biggest problems I have with redevelopment agencies is that they don't create new money. They just shift around money from existing legal entities all into a redevelopment agency. And you can imagine when we're at 7.6 billion in this county, it was a huge shift of money. So what ended up happening is starting in 2012, it resulted in large one-time infusions of dollars into the county's budget because you had all of these properties. As they were dissolved, the proceeds would be given back to the taxing entities. Unfortunately, all these years later, there's only about 2 or 3, maybe 3 properties left, and they're not big. So all of the one-time infusions of redevelopment dollars that we've been getting starting in 2012 are just about dried up. But the elimination of RDAs or redevelopment agencies was just a game changer in a different way. So in addition to the one-time infusion of dollars, it also, you know, the way redevelopment works is when they look at an area that's supposed to be blighted, and then they say, look, there's blight in this area, so we're gonna call it a redevelopment area. Oops, I gotta go here so you can see my hand. And then they say, we're gonna cap the assessed valuation at the base year level. And then we're going to assume that through investments, we can increase that assessed valuation of that property. And then we'll get what's called tax increment, which is the taxes that are generated from the additional value that's added by the investment in infrastructure. And then we bond around it over on Wall Street to be able to do those infrastructure developments or implementations, and then we get tax increment to pay it. But the taxing entities only get the base year value. So now you have assessed valuations up here, base year values here, and the tax increment in between going to redevelopment agencies. Well, as soon as they were dissolved, everything went up like this. And suddenly we had much higher assessed valuations that we were taxing on. And that was good news, and especially for schools. Schools then got a whole lot more property taxes. Then what that meant is many more of them became basic aid. Remember what basic aid means. And when you're basic aid, you don't take from ERAF. Okay, so once they're not taking from ERAF because there are so many of them are basic aid, that leaves at the end of the year dollars left in the ERAF, and that Educational Revenue Augmentation Fund. And then what you do is you take whatever's left over. Remember, what's put in there is just our property taxes and everybody else's property taxes into that revenue fund that the state did back in the early 90s. So now it's left over, and then we get that back, and that's called, the term they use for it, it's a little bit of a misnomer, is excess ERAF, and that comes back to us in the county. And that's significant dollars, in the couple $100 million a year. So that brings us to the present era, 2012 to 2019. During that time, we saw lots and lots of growth. It was due for a couple of reasons. One, the economy got better. I'm sure you all remember that. And then also, as I just said, the dissolution of redevelopment agencies, which provided both one-time dollars through the liquidation of assets, and it also provided ongoing dollars through excess ERAF. And eventually, when all the bond debt is paid off from redevelopment agencies, sort of around, I think that's going to happen like in 2036, 2038, something like that. It should provide more resources. But either way, we got more resources during this era, and we were able to rebuild a lot of infrastructure. We were able to build a lot of programs with you. We were able to hire a lot more people as we went forward and built the safety net. We went from something like 14 or 15,000 employees to our height, which was about almost 22,000 employees. So with that context in mind, what happens in 2020? That results in a projected $300 to $600 million deficit. First and foremost, most foundationally, our expenses are rising faster than our revenue growth. So to explain that, there's some big factors. One is pension costs. We contract with CalPERS for our pensions, and CalPERS board is governed separately, and CalPERS decided that their assumed rate of return on their investment portfolio was too high. And they said they were assuming a 7.75% rate of return, and they decided that was too aggressive and that couldn't be achieved, so they reduced it to 7%. And then if you think about that, what that means is our portion of that is only going to assume to make 7% in order to stay even and pay pension costs. They charge us today more money to put into that pot. And that money has been growing at $75 million a year additional every year. So that's just new requirements we have to pay towards CalPERS every year. In addition, I think so many of you have dealt with this with your own CBOs. Healthcare costs keep rising faster than inflation. And then finally, we do have labor contracts with our almost 22,000 employees. And we've had a history here of providing 3% general wage increases each year, plus realignments and some other things that adds to 3% plus in increases in labor costs. And then finally, we've had a booming economy for a long time, and the economy just by naturally, everything's like a cycle. The economy is starting to slow down, which means you have reduced sales taxes, and then you're going to you still have increased in assessed valuations, but that increase is going down as well. And then finally, as I mentioned, the one-time redevelopment dollars from asset liquidations have dried up, except for the last couple of projects. So the long and short of it is, under normal circumstances, we need assessed valuation to increase more than 6.5% or so that we can stay even with all of the factors that I just mentioned to you. And anything lower than that results in contraction. Going forward, we see that assessed valuation number just continuing to go, the increase to be less than 6%. So it's going to be tough. For all of these reasons, in our February mid-year report, we reported to the Board of Supervisors that we had a projected ongoing budget deficit of $180 million due to all of these dynamics. That was bad enough, and that was in mid-February, but then the pandemic hit. And to prepare for the potential surge of cases, we canceled elective surgeries, we brought in temporary nurses, we really did what we needed to do to keep everybody safe. But the bottom line, that required us to have a lot of expenses at the same time that we didn't have some of our revenues from hospitals. All hospitals across California, even in the nation, saw significant cuts because of canceling elective surgeries and everything else. Fortunately, in some ways, although it's just unfortunate in others, we got money in the CARES Act, which Congress and the President signed. And under that formula, we get $336 million as a region. The problem, though, is it was sort of done in the East Coast, and in the East Coast, cities provide a lot of safety net services. In the West Coast, it's the counties who do it, not the cities. That's why we run hospitals and we run, public health and behavioral health and all that. But because the formula came out of DC, they ended up looking at giving any city or county more than 500,000 residents direct allocations. So of the $336 million that came to our county as a region, the way the formula worked is the county got $158 million of that, and the city of San Jose got $178 million of that. And so that's another big hit where we had the expense, but we didn't get the reimbursement from the federal government the way other counties did, because we're the only county in the Bay Area that had a city greater than 500,000. I should note that we also got an additional $30 million allocation, but that wasn't nearly enough to make up for the loss. Then the state declared that it had a $54 billion deficit. Some of you may recall that. And it looked to how do we balance our budget? And they looked to excess ERAF. There are 5 counties with excess ERAF. It's us, San Mateo, San Francisco, Marin, and Napa. And they said, we're going to go back to the fiscal year 18-19, penalize you for not, doing the calculations according to guidance that it was interesting guidance that they had not yet issued in June of 2020. And that would have cost us about another $164 million. I think Supervisor Chavez will talk more about where we are on that, but there's still a potential that we could lose up to $164 million if the state controller takes the guidance of the Department of Finance and implements the same scheme. So we started with the $180 million deficit. We added 164 due to ERAF. That's $344 million ongoing. And then just to cut it short, because I see my time is just about up, we still are waiting for the state and federal governments. We rely on a lot of their dollars to keep us going. And the state has come out with a budget, but it has trigger cuts depending on what the federal government does. And so we need to see what happens there. So what's our strategy going forward? We're going to have a priority setting session with the board on August 12th. We're going to try to do things in thirds and have in August about roughly 100 million cut out of the budget. Fortunately, some of that, or a good chunk of that, will be vacant positions, but there's going to be some other big cuts that we need to make to get to that roughly 100 million. We're going to start then in, we're going to start do a second third in November, and then we're going to see how the federal and state budgets come out to see if we have to do a third later on. And then either way, we know FY 21-22 is going to be difficult, so we're in strategic discussions now, trying to figure out how to provide the services we do with limited resources. I want to just comment that we are working hard to bring a race and equity lens to our budget decision making. We've been holding bi-weekly meetings that we call Innovation Fridays, where we are trying to use the GARE framework. GARE is the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, and we're working hard to provide those tools to our departments so they can look at their rethinking of how to provide services with a race and equity lens. Going forward, we'll focus on the county's core mission, look at service redesign and having it being client-centered, bring community into discussion and use that racial equity lens. So you are our valued partners in getting all this work done. We hope to strategize with you as we strategize to implement ways to serve our community with less resources. Done right, we hope to enhance the outcomes we see. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to provide that background. I'm happy to provide any detail with questions, but I think now I turn it over to Supervisor Chavez, and then we'll be here to answer questions. Thank you so much.
So thank you for that, Miguel. We certainly appreciate that historical overview of our current county budget and how we've gotten to today. As many of you have inquired, that was a lot of information that Miguel shared, and we did record his portion of the presentation, and we can make that available for you. We are now going to turn it over to Supervisor Cindy Chavez, who's president of the board. She will provide us an update with some of the advocacy that has happened around trying to protect those excess ERAF dollars that Miguel spoke so eloquently about. Many of you have participated in advocacy at the state level to protect this valuable source of funding for the county, which definitely seeds a lot of dollars for the county's general fund, which again also supports our county safety net services and many of the services the nonprofit community provides. And to tell us a little bit more about that current state of play is a Board of Supervisors President Cindy Chavez. And I believe Cindy has joined us, and if not, her Senior Budget and Policy Director, Paul Murphy, will kind of kick things off. So Paul or Cindy, we turn it over to you.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. I know we're all in our places with bright, shiny faces. And I'm excited that you guys are all together thinking and strategizing about how to help our community thrive and survive in this really tough time. So first of all, I want to say thank you to each and every one of you, because your letters, your phone calls were so effective that you protected ERAF. And for this county in the short run, that was over $207 million, as I'm sure Miguel told you. And you were so effective that, you know, we got people from Sacramento yelling at us, which was great, because that told me that we were very, very much on their screen. And remember, during the budget process, it's such a massive process to get anybody's attention on something like this, given all that they were doing statewide, could only be done with the leadership of all of you. I also want to say the second thing you guys did that was beautiful, you not only spoke up for Santa Clara County, but you woke up the other counties and their nonprofits went hog wild, and that was really helpful to all of us. Now, where does that leave us? Here was the good news, and if Miguel said this, I apologize, I'll be brief on this part. The good news is that the state of California decided, instead of just cutting this money right away, that they were going to reseed the responsibility for this money to the state controller. That in their trailer bill, what they said is the state controller has to work with the Department of Finance to figure out the right calculations for how we move forward with this resource. We then had an opportunity to speak, myself and James Williams, who's our county counsel, who has played a leadership role on really understanding ERAF, had a chance to meet with Controller Yee and her staff, and they made it very clear to us that they were going to be neutral, that there had been, that there was no agreement about how to move forward, except that they had to move forward in partnership with, I forgot the exact words, but it was in consultation with the Department of Finance. Betty let us know that there would be some opportunity for community input. Our staff is working with the other counties that are impacted with the legal teams and that side, and also our financial folks, so that we could give more shared and concrete information. And the one message Betty did say to us is, don't come at us with 42 different ideas. Let's have one from all the counties. And then as that gets more meat on the bone, we'll come back to you, update you, and then talk about how to proceed. I would just ask that as it relates to the controller, that I think the only thing we want to say is, you know, thank you. We're appreciating that you're going to give this a fair shake. So any of you who know her or want to share an email with her, it should be very informal, very kind. Don't lobby them, because they're really looking at themselves right now as a neutral party. I think we just want to say we're grateful that you are, you know, playing a leadership role in resolving this, and look forward to learning more. You know, really, really soft, if you know her, you know, to be kind about that. If I could, I'm just going to pivot to one last thing that I heard Miguel talk about. Yesterday, I put forward a resolution. So two things. We talked about our priority setting session briefly yesterday on the board. This is something I've been wanting to do forever, and we finally are getting it agendized. But the second thing is I put forward a recommendation on the board taking an equity pledge, and that equity pledge would frame up the way that we're approaching budgeting. So that the staff now has a chance to take a look at what I have sent them, to give their flavor to it in partnership with the way we're thinking about GARE, and put that into our priority setting session and our discussions with my colleagues. So anyway, I tried to say a lot in a few seconds. Wendy, am I good on time? Or
you are perfect, Supervisor Chavez. So we really appreciate that update. And now we do have a few minutes for Q&A with President Chavez and Miguel. And some of you actually submitted questions already in a pre-town hall questionnaire that we circulated yesterday. So if you want to go ahead and submit a question, please use the raise hand function on your participant control panel. You can also enter the question into chat, or you can also private message me with your question, and I may elect to read it. And so as we wait for people to raise their hand, I'll go ahead and start off with a question that has been submitted via pre-town hall questionnaire we circulated. And so Miguel or Supervisor Chavez, feel free to chime in if you feel strongly about either of these. The question is, human services are even more critical during COVID, yet the county budget, as we've heard, is also extremely stretched. How are you working with community organizations like SVCN and innovative technologies to streamline access to social services?
So I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I would turn to Miguel, and I think Miguel too, and staff to help us understand how they're engaging all of you right now.
Part of, as I mentioned, the GARE framework, Government Alliance on Race and Equity, you know, a lot of those tools do talk about, you know, because we want to be client-centered, we want to hear from community, is to, you know, as part of the tool, is set up those meetings, have community input from those with lived experience, and from our partners on the ground. So that's part of it. I think part of it is also, you know, all the meetings of the Board of Supervisors by their nature are public, and when the board sets priorities, it is going to be a board vote, but the board, of course, also is there to listen to community as well as part of that process. And then just hold the whole budget process in general. I mean, the way governments are structured under the Public Records Act and the Brown Act and everything else, it's all, you know, a public process. So we will be doing our level best to get the information out there. I think one of our biggest challenges is, hopefully the presentation made clear, so much of this is still uncertain, right? We need to see where the federal government comes down on things, which is going to affect how the state comes down on things with its trigger cuts, which is going to then impact how we move forward with the county. But all that is process yet to come within the budget process within the board's priority setting meeting and everything else. And I certainly encourage and hope that you all participate, and not just at that level, but with departments as we implement those GARE tools and have those incredibly important discussions.
And and one thing I would suggest, Wendy, as you come out of your retreat, give us ideas about the best way to do that, because as you know, we meet with subsets of SVCN on different topics and with your members all the time. But if there's something that you're interested in that is more structured, I think that would be great. The other thing I would say is if there are 5 or 6 items that come out of your retreat where you're setting priorities, share those with us, because our priority setting session, and by the way, I don't think we're going to get done in one day, but it's the first time the board has actually done this. So we're meeting on August 11th. August, what day is this? I think it's around the 13th of August. So if you have things that you would like us to consider, put them in and we'll make sure we discuss them at that meeting.
Great, thank you for that, Supervisor. I guess one question that I think that is certainly top of mind for our nonprofit providers this morning is, given the county's budget deficit, how will departmental budget targets be determined and what principles are being applied for reductions? I think there is some curiosity as to whether or not those reductions and budget targets will be made public. And so would love to hear a little bit about kind of the county's approach to dealing with this deficit. I mean, Miguel talked a little bit about cost savings related to not filling vacant positions, but I think obviously we have an array of providers from across different county departments. And so I think they are just kind of concerned about the fates of their contracts. So if you either of you
Sure,
speak to
I'm going to I'll let Miguel jump in on this, but I will also just say that one of the things that we have to figure out is how to grow the pie. And because I think as soon as we get into scarcity, and by the way, I don't think this is just a problem for us. I think nationally, if the federal government doesn't keep putting money into local and state government, the problem that we're going to have that's pretty significant is, as you know, that every Great Depression, that if we've been able to spend money to get ourselves out of it through our public sector partners, and that includes you, we maintain a level of health in the economy that we can't do any other way. So we took a vote last night to try to get a 5/8 cent sales tax on the ballot. We were unsuccessful in getting the 4th vote. We have 3 votes. And so the question now is, do we go out for a special tax? And so some of you I'm going to be having conversations with about that over the next few days, because we got to figure out whether or not we want to even try that. But I have to say, you guys, we got to grow the pie, or otherwise it's just going to be kind of a train wreck. That being said, you asked more specific questions about the internal process, and for that I'd have to go to Miguel.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with just to follow up Supervisor Chavez on your comment. The federal government is a challenge. You may remember Mitch McConnell when the Democrats were trying to get relief dollars for local and state governments. I think Mitch McConnell said, no, let's not do it. We can't afford it. Let's just let them file for bankruptcy. So, I have to hand it off to and give a huge applause, and we should all support Congresswoman Lofgren and Anna Eshoo and Ro Khanna and all of them. They're all just working so hard on our behalf. So we'll see where we end up. We do have about an $8.3 billion budget, and so everyone thinks we have a lot of ability to, make up the difference that we're talking about, $300 to $600 million. The truth is, the way the budget is structured, so much of that is restricted revenues that have to be used for a specific purpose. So much so, right, when the revenue streams come in, we don't really have discretion over it. So what they call discretionary revenues is actually only about 1.7 billion. So if you think about that, 1.7 billion, 300 to 600 million out of that is huge. And so when we set targets, what we have to look at, the big problem is actually in the general fund. So we're looking at, how do we take out the general fund component? And there's only, certain departments that use that general fund. Now, some general fund has to be used for law enforcement, or, to run the jail, to do a variety of different things. Because you have to have, we do have 2,000 people which we went from about 3,400 down to maybe 2,100 today, but we still have to pay for that, and that comes out of general fund. So, for now, we're still just in the midst of talking. We don't know where we're going to end up, as I said before, but we have given targets to those departments that use a big portion of general fund, and we're asking them to come back with their best effort to try and reduce their budgets. And then, as I said, we're going to do it in thirds, and it's going to be a little bit phased in. But those, we are looking at, both deleting vacant positions, and then also we have a process in place where if somebody leaves and we have a new vacancy, before we fill it, we have an executive team that looks and says, look, is this a position we should freeze, or is this one that we let them rehire into in light of our budget challenge? But it's mostly looking at departments that rely on the general fund and providing them targets, at least at the moment, and it's an ever-evolving discussion and process.
Thank you for that, Miguel. And I want to just take us to something that Supervisor Chavez just mentioned about really growing the pie. And one of those ways to do that is getting a sales tax increase passed. And so Steve Eckert from the Alamo Counseling Center asks, what are the next steps regarding sales tax? And Supervisor Chavez, I know you've already talked a little bit about that, but wanted to see if you wanted to use this time to expand on what help looks like from the CBO community.
So thank you for that, Wendy. What happened last night, or whenever we voted on it, it feels like our meetings never end, right? But what happened is that we had a 3-2 vote, and what that did is it kept alive. So in order to have staff work on the resolution that would be needed to be put on the ballot, we needed 3 votes. In order to place it on the ballot, we would need 4 for a general tax, 3 for a special tax. A special tax would require us to hit 2/3 plus 1 in order to win. That is a really, really exceptionally high bar. The challenge, though, is that if we don't take the shot right now, I don't know when we'll have another opportunity to do this. And my fear is that even if Schools and Communities First passes, which I hope it does, that revenue won't start coming online for another 3 to 4 years. So what do we do in that interim, especially given the hole in the budget that Miguel just talked about? So what I'm going to be asking people this week is how much are people in? 2/3 is really hard. It's a very high risk. Are people willing to volunteer? Are they willing to put money into the campaign? And if I think we can raise enough money and we have enough support, then I'm going to ask my colleagues to put it on the ballot. If I don't, I will not ask them to do that. The special meeting is August 6th. And that's a day we'll make a decision. So we've got a little bit of time, not much, but we got a little bit of time. So I'll be reaching out to all of you to get some thoughts. And Clara, if you and Wendy want to pull together a group, we can have a deeper discussion about it. Here's the other thing that's tricky about this. What's tricky is that because it's a special tax, we have to be very explicit about what we're spending money on, and it really impedes our flexibility. But what that also means is that a big enough portion of that resource will have to go directly into the general fund, because as Miguel will tell you, and you guys know who've worked in government, that some of the ways we keep federal and state money is by matching it with general fund locally. And so the balance of how we structure this is going to be very, very challenging. What we pulled on was COVID-19, because I believe that, again, without the federal government kind of getting their act together, the amount of resource it's going to take to protect people of color from this virus is it's going to be a lot, and it's going to go on for years. The other thing is that we know that there's been no help for childcare businesses in particular to stay afloat. So we're losing childcare homes by every week another one goes out of business. If we're going to get the economy back up and we're going to protect these women-owned businesses, that's a place that we'd want to make an investment. And the other that I think is really critical is making sure that we can do something to alleviate the rents that people are going to have to pay back, because otherwise we're going to have a flood of homelessness happening month by month. And so I'm also looking at some of that money for rent relief. So the point of that is that with you guys, with SVCN, we need to get your priorities there, because we're going to have to see if we can put a package together that people can be excited about. Because it's going to be, if we do this, it's going to be really hard. I'm actually feeling very optimistic, because I haven't had much sleep, I guess, but I just feel like we cannot leave anything on the field. We got to fight. And so I want to take a good look at this.
And can I just add, because it's so funny you said that, because I have in my notes here, I want to say fight like hell. you know, and not just, you know, locally, not just at the state, not at the federal. Think all three. They're all important. On the local level, Cindy just talked about fighting like hell to get more resources locally. At the state level, we talked about ERAF, fight like hell so that we get a good guidance and don't get that money taken away. And then at the federal level, again, what our members of Congress are doing is amazing work. Think about it. We have Zoe and Anna and everybody else who are friends with the speaker, who has an awful big role in this. So if people have those relationships, please leverage them. Now, I'm not going to say the federal government can save us in a way because they're talking one-time dollars. And, you know, it could be a significant chunk because they can print money. If they print another $1 trillion to help out state and local governments, that helps us out. But what that one-time money does is it'll allow us to give more time so we can be more strategic and deliberate and work with all of you and everybody else to have and redeploy resources in different ways, but with more time to get there. Transitioning is always important, and those dollars are going to be critical in giving us the time we need to make the adjustments we need to make.
Thank you for that, Miguel. I know we're running a little bit short on time, but I just wanted to see very quickly, Miguel and Supervisor Chavez, if you have time just to answer one more question. Obviously, we have a number of questions that people want to ask, and we will do our best to make sure that both Miguel and Supervisor Chavez receive those questions so they know the full extent of issues that are top of mind for our nonprofit community. Just wanted to check if Miguel and Supervisor Chavez, is it okay if we have one more question before you need to exit today?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you for that. Thank you for indulging us. And I'll go ahead and call on Paul Soto, who has raised his hand. Paul, if we'll go ahead and unmute you, and please go ahead and present your question.
Good morning, Supervisor Chavez, and thank you for that forensic analysis, Miguel. I'm a fifth generation Sanjonero. My father picked fruit in Salsipuedes in the 1930s and 40s. And so I'm glad that people are have come around to a point to where they could talk about equity. That's nice. I'm glad that, you know, as a society, we've done that. I do volunteer work at Conexión and Caras. And what I've seen historically is this constant neglect of the Mexican. I don't use person of color. I don't use those terms. I use a Mexican or a Chicano. These are the people that have suffered the most. These are the people that historically have been marginalized, have been discriminated against, and the redlining policies concentrated wealth in Willow Glen and the Rose Garden. I'm in discussions with Dr. Stephen Peedy, who wrote The Devil in Silicon Valley. I've been communicating with him, and we are, what has happened historically in this city, in this county, is just not acceptable, and it's not okay anymore. And as an ancestor that has experienced that, what I'd like to know is why can't we tax the Rose Garden and Willow Glen specifically when we already know for a fact that the wealth was generated in those, concentrated in those particular areas at the expense of Mexican labor and child labor. Children were exploited, their labor. What they did is they started school in September because of the harvest season. And so they're spraying pesticides on these schools, and they're sending children out there to pick the fruit. And then that wealth was concentrated amongst those two particular neighborhoods. And nobody denies this because this is part of the historical record. So my question is, how are those specifically, not through GARE, because I'm not concerned with GARE. I'm talking about San Jose and Santa Clara County directly addressing those particular issues?
Yeah, Paul, I don't know how to answer that because I don't know a lawful way to do what you're asking. I think the reason that schools and communities first is so important is that it really is taxing wealth and it's not regressive. And it's part of the reason I'm really excited about that ballot initiative. I think but I don't disagree with the bigger point you're raising, which is how do we redistribute resources in a more equitable, fair way that really allows our communities to thrive. But just taxing those two communities would be difficult for us to do. Now, again, schools and communities first really emphasizes us taxing the business community, which has been, I think, gotten away with not being taxed in a fair way for a long time. And the amount of resource that'll come out of that, I think, is very, very important. And then the other thing I'll just say, I've been thinking a lot about, if I had a magic wand, what would be the one thing? If I could only fix one thing, what would it be? And it would be that I would want to heavily, heavily invest in education in a way that funded all schools based on need. And I think that would be so, I think the world would be so much better and so different. But I understand what you're saying, Paul. Thank you for the question.
And can I simply add, you know, when I hear that question, it's a very good question. It's why I started by saying, I think they made mistakes in the late 70s where they froze inequity into our California finance system. But I think there's two important questions. One is the one you addressed, who pays? And the second one is the even more important question in some ways, and that's who gets the tax dollars. The allocation of dollars is what we need to be fighting for. That's sort of done at the state level. And then, you know, and even at the federal level, they do tax policy. You know, I think we should partner on advocacy efforts on tax policy, both on the who pays and who gets questions. I can only say I agree with you. And that's, you know, part of the GARE framework is understanding those structural inequities. And then there's the, I guess the last part, who gets, you know, does define how we provide services. You said you don't have a concern with that. Yeah, because we are committed to using the GARE process to try and then implement services in a way that accounts for the inequities we see in society. And I'll end by saying, you know, the virus to me has been very interesting. In many respects, I think it's a virus that has shown true colors in people, but also in society. And it's really shown the true colors of how we're structured and the inequities we have in society. And I think that implies on us a duty to try and address those inequities head on.
Appreciate that perspective, Miguel. And why don't we go ahead and give a silent round of applause to Supervisor Chavez and Miguel for spending a little part of their morning with us to give us the lowdown on kind of what to expect with the county budget. I know that they have a 10 o'clock, and so I want to be respectful of their time.
And thank you. Can they say thank you? And
absolutely.
Also, can I also say, you guys, I just put my email in. So if there are questions you want to ask specifically, just send them over and I'll respond as I am able. And I also just want to say again, thank you. And you probably also saw that on Tuesday, yesterday, we finalized the first set of tranche of investments we're making in door-to-door communication and more strategic communication around COVID-19. So one of the things I'd really like to ask SVCN is, as we move forward, give us feedback on how you think all that's working, because we can't do that alone. We got to do that in partnership with you. But you guys, I'm so thankful for your partnership and your leadership. Keep up the great work. I know you're exhausted, and we're going to be in this for the long haul. But for those of you, especially who are providing services to the neediest, you all are. Thank you. I hope to get invited back again. Bye.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you both for spending your morning with us. We appreciate that.